Let's get to a major U.S. Supreme Court ruling right now that could throw a new curveball into the November election. The U.S. Supreme Court upholding Indiana's strict law requiring voters to show a picture ID before they can cast their ballots. Let's bring in our justice correspondent, Kelly Arena. Kelly, this could have an enormous impact, probably more in November than next week in Indiana, but give our viewers the background, the enormity of what the U.S. Supreme Court has decided today.
Well, Wolf, now that the Supreme Court has upheld Indiana's law, it basically gives a green light to other states to pass similar legislation, which, of course, would be just in time for the November election.
Remember this? Protests, hanging chads, charges of voter intimidation. The 2000 presidential race raised questions about election integrity, and Democrats say today's Supreme Court ruling may raise even more.
The voter ID scam is a suppression tactic used by many people to undermine the right to vote in this country.
In upholding Indiana's strict voter ID law, the toughest in the nation, the High Court cleared the way for other states to follow suit. Voting rights advocates say the impact will be felt most heavily among the poor, the elderly, minorities, people who tend to vote Democratic.
It's actually infuriating. It's infuriating that people who really need to impact the system the most are being denied the right to do so.
The hurdles are real for people like Karen Vaughn, a quadriplegic who doesn't have a driver's license or a passport. She had to pay more than $100 to get documentation to prove who she was.
They just don't care. We're unimportant.
Indiana isn't the only state to require ID. More than 20 states ask voters to present identification, including most of the key battleground states. Election officials say the laws are necessary to prevent fraud.
It's so easy for someone to claim that there's somebody else and steal an election that way.
But there is little hard evidence to back that up. And the ACLU and People for the American Way say there's evidence instead to suggest that disadvantaged voters will have a hard time. In past elections in Ohio and Florida, some voters reportedly complained that poll workers tried to turn them away, even with proper ID.
The state election officials say that they're working very hard to make sure everyone knows what the rules are, what kind of ID is accepted, so everyone will be ready in November. But some experts say that Democrats are just going to have to work a lot harder to make sure that their members are well informed, Wolf.
Thanks very much, Kelly, for that major decision. And today's 6-3 High Court ruling reflects a splintered U.S. Supreme Court. Justice John Paul Stevens, the chief dissenter in Bush versus Gore in that ruling back in 2000, wrote the majority opinion. This time, he was appointed by Gerald Ford. The 5 other justices supporting the majority opinion include some of its most conservative members. All were nominated by Republican presidents. The 3 justices who dissented, David Souter, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Breyer, all dissented in the Bush versus Gore court decision as well. Souter was nominated by the first President Bush. Ginsburg and Breyer were nominated by Bill Clinton. Enormous ramifications potentially by this Supreme Court decision today. Much more on this story coming up later here in the